The first thing he noticed was not the silence. It was the feeling that something was watching him. Not a person, not an animal, something older than both. The desert stretched out in every direction like a wound that refused to heal cracked earth, and pale dust running all the way to the edge of the sky, where the sun sat heavy and swollen bleeding gold across the horizon. Ethan Cole stood at the edge of a dirt road that led to nowhere and stared into the emptiness ahead. His boots were military-grade, worn soft from years of use, but still holding together the way good things do when they are built for war. His pack sat high on his shoulders. His jaw was tight. His eyes, gray and deep-set, moved the way a man's eyes move when he has spent years scanning rooftops and doorways and dark corners for threats that most people never think about. He was 34 years old. He looked older. War does that. Beside him, the dog stood perfectly still. A German shepherd, lean and powerful, with a dark saddle coat and intelligent amber eyes that caught the last of the evening light. His name was Shadow, and he had earned that name not because someone gave it to him, but because he never left Ethan's side. Not once, not ever. Shadow's ears rotated slowly, picking up sounds the human ear could never catch. His nose twitched. His body was low tense, coiled like a spring. He was reading the desert the way he had once read the streets of Fallujah and the mountain passes of Kandahar. And right now, the desert was telling him something. A low growl rumbled in Shadow's chest. Not loud, not aggressive, just a warning, a quiet signal between two creatures who had learned to trust each other with their lives. Ethan looked down at the dog. "What do you see, boy?" Shadow did not answer. He just stared ahead into the vast and shimmering nothing, where the heat waves twisted the air into shapes that were almost real, but not quite. And somewhere out there, hidden beneath 50 years of sand and silence and secrets, something was waiting for them. But to understand why Ethan Cole was standing in the middle of the Nevada desert with nothing but a dog and a dead man's map, you need to understand how he got here. You need to understand what he lost. And more importantly, you need to understand what he was trying to outrun. Because Ethan Cole was not on a journey, he was on a retreat. And there is a difference between a man who is searching for something and a man who is running from everything. 3 months earlier, Ethan's life looked like a photograph that someone had torn in half and then tried to tape back together. He lived in an aluminum trailer on the outskirts of Kingman, Arizona, a town so small and quiet that even the wind seemed bored passing through it. The trailer sat on a patch of dry ground behind a gas station that had closed 2 years ago. There was no lawn, no fence, no neighbors close enough to hear anything, which was exactly the way Ethan wanted it. He worked part-time at a garage in town, fixing trucks and old sedans for people who could not afford the dealership. He was good with his hands. He always had been. In the SEALs, they used to say Ethan could disassemble an engine blindfolded and put it back together before you finished your coffee. But that was a long time ago. That was before Afghanistan, before Helmand province, before the night that split his life into two halves, the half where he believed in something and the half where he did not. He did not talk about Helmand, not to the VA therapist who called every 2 weeks, not to his sister Claire, who left voicemails he rarely returned, not to anyone. But that did not mean he had forgotten. Forgetting was a luxury his mind refused to give him. Every night, the same dream. A valley in Helmand, narrow and steep. The kind of terrain that made the back of your neck prickle because you absolutely knew that someone was watching from above. Ethan was leading a 6-man patrol. They had intelligence, solid intelligence that a high-value target was sheltering in a compound just ahead. Ethan made the call. Move forward, take the compound. Standard operation. Tommy Beckett was walking point. Tommy, who had grown up 3 houses down from Ethan in a small town outside of Fort Worth, Texas. Tommy, who had enlisted the same week Ethan did because he said it did not feel right letting his best friend go to war alone. Tommy, who carried a battered old compass around his neck even though every man on the team had GPS. Because Tommy believed that some things should not depend on batteries and satellites and technology that could fail you when you needed it most. They entered the valley. The compound was quiet, too quiet, and then the world exploded. The ambush came from three directions at once. Rifle fire from the ridgeline, RPGs from the east slope, and then the IED buried in the path they had just walked across, detonating behind them and cutting off their retreat. In the chaos that followed, Ethan saw Tommy do something that he would replay 10,000 times in his mind for the rest of his life. Tommy turned, saw the muzzle flash from the ridge, calculated the angle in a fraction of a second, and threw himself into Ethan, driving him down into a drainage ditch, just as the bullets tore through the air where Ethan's head had been. Tommy landed on top of him. For a moment their eyes met. Tommy smiled, that ridiculous, unshakable Tommy Beckett smile. And then he said 4 words that Ethan would hear every night for the next 9 years. "Good call, big brother." Then Tommy pushed himself up to return fire, and a round caught him in the neck. He was dead before he hit the ground. 2 more men died in the next 90 seconds. By the time air support arrived, the valley was a graveyard. Ethan survived because Tommy had pushed him into that ditch. He survived because his best friend chose in a split second to save him instead of saving himself. And that was the wound that would not heal. Not the bullet fragment still lodged near his left shoulder blade. Not the ringing in his ears that never fully went away. It was the knowledge that he had made the call. He had given the order to move forward. And 3 men, 3 brothers, had paid for that decision with their lives. The Navy gave Ethan a medal. He put it in a drawer and never looked at it again. After Hellman, things fell apart the way things do when the center of a man's life has been blown out, and there is nothing left to hold the rest together. Ethan finished his deployment, came home, tried to be normal, failed. He could not sleep without dreaming. He could not hear a car backfire without dropping to the ground. He could not sit in a restaurant with his back to the door. He drank, not enough to call it a problem, at least that is what he told himself, but enough to blur the edges of the memories so they did not cut quite so deep. His mother called, his sister called, his father Daniel, a quiet and serious man who had spent 30 years working at a hardware store after his own military service and never once talked about what he had done in uniform, just looked at Ethan with eyes that understood too much and said too little. "You will find your way back, son," Daniel told him once, sitting on the porch of the family home in Flagstaff watching the sun go down. "It takes time, but you will find it." Ethan wanted to believe him. But Daniel Cole died 14 months later, lung cancer diagnosed too late, gone too fast. And whatever wisdom the old man carried, whatever secrets he held, whatever he might have said if he had been given more time, all of it went into the ground with him. That was 2018, 3 years before the desert. After Daniel died, Ethan stopped trying. He sold his apartment, bought the trailer, moved to Kingman, cut the threads one by one until there was almost nothing left connecting him to the world of the living. And then Shadow came. The VA therapist, a woman named Dr. Reeves, who had more patience than Ethan deserved, told him about a program in Phoenix that paired combat veterans with retired military working dogs, dogs that had served overseas, dogs that had been wounded or traumatized, or both. Dogs that needed someone as much as the veterans needed them. Ethan did not want to go. He told Dr. Reeves it was pointless. She told him it was a condition of continuing his prescription. He went. The facility in Phoenix was clean and bright, full of trainers in khaki shirts and dogs of every size and breed. They introduced Ethan to 3 dogs that first day. A Labrador who licked his hand and wagged his tail. A Belgian Malinois who performed commands like a machine. And Shadow. Shadow was different. He sat in the corner of his kennel watching Ethan with those amber eyes and did not move, did not wag, did not approach. When the trainer reached for him, Shadow bared his teeth and let out a growl that sounded like it came from somewhere deeper than his throat, somewhere old and wounded, and not ready to trust. "This one's tough," the trainer said, pulling his hand back. 5 years old, 3 deployments, Iraq mostly. IED took out his handler and damaged his left rear leg. He's got a slight limp when he's tired. We've tried to pair him with 4 different veterans. He rejected every one. Ethan looked at the dog. The dog looked back. And in that moment, something passed between them. Not trust, not yet. Something quieter than that. Recognition. The look of one broken thing seeing itself reflected in another. "Leave me with him," Ethan said. "Sir, I wouldn't recommend." "Leave me with him." The trainer left. Ethan sat down on the concrete floor outside the kennel, his back against the chain link, and said nothing. He did not reach for the dog, did not call him, did not try. He just sat there the way a man sits when he has nowhere else to be and nothing left to prove. An hour passed. Shadow did not move. Ethan came back the next day, and the day after, and the day after that. Each day he sat on the floor and said nothing. On the 4th day, Shadow stood up, walked to the front of the kennel, and lay down 2 feet from where Ethan sat. On the 7th day, the distance was 1 foot. On the 12th day, Ethan woke from a nightmare he did not remember, falling asleep into thrashing and gasping on the concrete floor, and found Shadow pressed against his back, warm and solid, and utterly still, as if the dog was saying, "I am here. I am not leaving. You are not alone." It was the first time in years that Ethan's heart rate returned to normal within minutes instead of hours. He took Shadow home that week, and from that day forward they were inseparable. 2 damaged creatures moving through the world together, each one watching the other's back, each one giving the other a reason to keep going. The trainer's words stayed with Ethan long after he left Phoenix. "This dog rejected 4 people before you. He chose you, and he never chooses wrong." At the time, Ethan thought it was just a nice thing to say. He did not yet understand how true it was. Now you understand the man, but you do not yet understand why he walked into the desert. For that, you need to know about the box. It arrived on a Tuesday 3 months after Shadow came home with Ethan. Claire called first, her voice careful and gentle in the way that people speak when they are about to hand you something fragile. "Mom's moving to assisted living," she said. "I've been cleaning out the house. I found something in the basement behind the water heater. Dad hid it there. It's locked. A combination lock, 4 digits. I tried everything I could think of. His birthday, Mom's birthday, their anniversary. Nothing works." She paused. "I think it's meant for you, Ethan. You were always more like him than I was." The box arrived by mail 3 days later. Small metal olive drab, the kind of surplus ammunition box you could buy at any Army-Navy store in America. The combination lock was old but solid. Ethan sat at his kitchen table, Shadow lying at his feet, and stared at it for a long time. He tried dates. His own birthday, Tommy's birthday, the date of Daniel's enlistment. Nothing. Then, almost without thinking, he punched in the date of Daniel's discharge from the army. The lock clicked open. Inside, the air smelled like old paper and gun oil. Ethan reached in and pulled out the contents one by one, laying them on the table in a row. A set of military decorations with no unit designation, no branch insignia, no identifying marks of any kind. Just the medals themselves stripped of context, as if someone had deliberately removed every clue about where they came from. A hand-drawn map on heavy paper, creased and yellowed, showing a section of desert in central Nevada. A single location marked with a small X, no road leading to it, no town nearby, just empty space and the mark that said, "Here." A small leather notebook filled with dense, cramped handwriting, some of it in English, some of it in a simple substitution code, the kind Daniel had taught Ethan as a game when he was 10 years old. Letters replaced by numbers in a pattern that young Ethan had memorized and never forgotten. At the time, he thought his father was just playing with him. Now he understood that Daniel had been handing him a key years in advance to a door he had not yet found. And a photograph. Black and white, slightly faded, showing a group of young soldiers standing in front of a low concrete building, in what looked like a desert landscape. 6 of the 12 men in the unit, caught in an unguarded moment, smiling at the camera with the easy confidence of men who had not yet learned what the world was capable of taking from them. On the back, written in Daniel's unmistakable hand, Unit 17, Station 7, Tonopah, Nevada, March 1970. D. Cole F. Harlan, Jake Rivera, B. Mitchell, S. Patterson, K. Greer. Ethan stared at the photograph. His father stood in the center, young and lean, with the same gray eyes Ethan saw every morning in the mirror. Daniel could not have been more than 25 in the picture. Younger than Ethan was now. Younger than Ethan felt he had ever been. He turned to the notebook and began decoding it with the substitution pattern Daniel had taught him as a child, the numbers falling into letters with a familiarity that felt like muscle memory. Most of the notebook was operational details, supply lists, and construction schedules, but the last page was written in plain English, as if Daniel had wanted to make sure that whoever found this book could read at least this much without any code at all. The words hit Ethan like a fist to the chest. I did not abandon him. I followed orders. But following orders and doing the right thing are not always the same. He read it again, and each time the words grew heavier. His father had never talked about his military service. Not once in 34 years. Ethan had always assumed Daniel had served a quiet, uneventful tour somewhere safe, maybe pushing paper at a stateside base. The medals suggested otherwise. The map suggested otherwise. And this sentence, this confession written in the handwriting of a man who had been dead for 3 years, suggested that Daniel Cole had carried a secret so heavy it had bent him for a lifetime. Ethan picked up the map. He pulled out his phone and entered the coordinates. The screen showed nothing. No roads, no structures, no settlements. Just a blank patch of desert between Tonopah and Goldfield, Nevada, less than 100 miles from the Nevada test site, where the United States government had once detonated nuclear weapons in the open air. He searched for Unit 17 in every military database he could access. Nothing. No records. No mention. As if the unit had never existed. And that was the moment Ethan Cole made a decision. Not a rational decision, not a careful one. The kind of decision a man makes when he has been carrying questions his whole life, and suddenly, for the first time, there might be answers. He called Claire, told her he was going away for a few days. She asked if he was okay. He did not answer directly. He said, "Dad was hiding something. You know how he was, never talked about any of it. This time I'm going to find out." There was a long pause on the line. Then Claire said quietly, "Be careful, Ethan, and call me, please." He packed the truck the next morning. Water for 5 days calculated for both himself and a 90-pound dog in desert heat, which meant twice what a solo hiker would carry. Dried food, a flashlight, a pry bar because the notebook mentioned a locked door. Shadow jumped into the passenger seat without being told, as if he already knew where they were going. They drove north through Arizona, crossed into Nevada, and followed Highway 95 through some of the emptiest land in America, past abandoned mines and ghost towns and vast stretches of nothing, where the only movement was the shadow of a hawk circling overhead. They reached Tonopah by late afternoon, a small town of 2,400 people that called itself the crossroads of nowhere, and kept driving until the pavement ended and the dirt began. Ethan parked the truck at the end of a fire road that petered out into sagebrush and dust. He shouldered his pack, clipped Shadow's lead, and looked out at the desert ahead. The sun was dropping toward the western mountains, painting everything in shades of amber and rust. The map said the location was roughly 18 miles northeast. 18 miles of open desert with no trail, no shade, and no certainty that anything was there at all. Shadow looked up at him. Ethan looked down at the dog. "All right," he said. "Let us go find out what the old man was hiding." They stepped off the road and into the desert. And behind them, the last traces of the world they knew disappeared in a cloud of fine white dust. They walked through the evening, and into the night navigating by the stars and the compass. Ethan carried the same compass that had once belonged to Tommy Beckett. The desert at night was a different world. The brutal heat gave way to a dry, biting cold that crept through clothing and settled into bone. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of their boots on hardpan and the occasional distant cry of a coyote somewhere in the darkness. Shadow walked close, his shoulder brushing Ethan's leg. The dog's limp was barely noticeable in the cool air, his muscles loose and his stride confident. But his ears never stopped moving, rotating like small radar dishes scanning the darkness for sounds that did not belong. They camped at dawn in the shelter of a rocky outcrop. Ethan rationed the water, carefully pouring Shadow's share into a collapsible bowl first, then drinking his own. The dog drank, then lay down beside Ethan and rested his head on his paws, watching the desert with patient, unblinking eyes. Ethan slept for 3 hours. No dreams. That was rare. Shadow's presence had that effect on him, as if the dog somehow absorbed the nightmares before they could take hold. They moved again in the late afternoon, when the worst of the heat had passed. The terrain grew rougher, the flat basin giving way to low ridges and shallow arroyos carved by flash floods that came once a decade and vanished in hours. Ethan checked the map, constantly adjusting their course, looking for landmarks that matched Daniel's hand-drawn notations. And then, on the second afternoon, Shadow stopped. It was sudden and absolute. One moment the dog was walking steadily beside Ethan, and the next he was frozen. Every muscle locked. His nose pointed northeast, his ears straight up. A low sound came from his throat, not a growl exactly. Something between alertness and recognition. The sound a dog makes when he has found something that his training tells him is important. Ethan dropped to one knee. He followed Shadow's gaze across the desert floor and saw it, a line, faint, almost invisible, running across the ground from northwest to southeast. At first he thought it was a natural feature, a ridge of harder rock exposed by erosion. But as he moved closer, he saw the rust, the geometric precision, the unmistakable shape of steel rails half buried in sand stretching in both directions as far as he could see. Railroad tracks, in the middle of nowhere, on no map he had ever seen. Ethan knelt beside the tracks and brushed away the sand with his hands. The rails were heavy gauge military specification, mounted on concrete ties that were cracked but still intact. This was not an old mining spur or a forgotten branch line. This was infrastructure built to last, built to carry heavy loads, built by people who knew exactly what they were doing and wanted it to survive. His heart was beating faster now. The map was right. His father had been here. But then he noticed something that made his breath catch. Footprints. In the sand beside the tracks, partially filled by wind but still visible, a set of boot prints. Not old, not fresh. Maybe a few months, maybe a year. Someone had walked along these tracks recently. Someone who knew they were here. And nearby, half buried in a clump of sagebrush, an empty plastic water bottle. The label was still readable. The expiration date printed on the cap said 2020. Just 1 year ago. Ethan stood up slowly. He looked north along the tracks into the shimmering heat, where the rails seemed to converge and vanish into the sky. Then he looked south, where they disappeared into the same impossible distance. Shadow pressed against his leg. The dog's body was vibrating with a contained energy, every fiber telling him to follow this trail wherever it led. Ethan reached down and touched the dog's head. "I know, boy," he said quietly. "I feel it too." He adjusted his pack, took a long drink of water, and began walking northeast along the forgotten rails, following the footprints of a stranger into a part of the desert that the rest of the world had decided did not exist. And somewhere ahead, hidden in the heat and the silence and the endless turning of sand against steel, the answers were waiting. Answers about his father. Answers about a unit that had been erased. Answers about a man who had been left behind. And one answer that Ethan was not yet ready for. An answer about himself. The tracks ran straight and true through the desert like a scar that time had tried to cover. but never fully healed. Ethan walked beside them, not on them a habit born from years of training that taught him never to walk on the obvious path, because the obvious path is where they bury the things that kill you. Shadow moved ahead in a low, steady trot, his nose working constantly, reading the invisible language of the desert. The way a scholar reads ancient text, finding meaning in things that ordinary eyes would never notice. The sun climbed higher. The temperature rose past 100 degrees by mid-morning and kept climbing, pressing down on the landscape like a hot iron on cloth, flattening everything beneath its weight. The air shimmered and bent, turning distant rocks into liquid shapes that swayed and dissolved and reformed into something else entirely. In this kind of heat, the mind begins to play tricks. Shadows become figures. Stones become faces. The line between what is real and what is memory starts to blur. Ethan drank sparingly but steadily, conscious of every ounce. He had calculated the water for 5 days, split between himself and a 90-pound dog in extreme heat, and the math was tight. Shadow needed more water than Ethan had anticipated. The dog panted constantly, his tongue hanging along his body, working overtime to cool itself in air that offered no relief. Ethan poured water for him every 90 minutes instead of every 2 hours, watching the supply drop faster than the plan allowed. By the end of day 3, they would be running close to the edge. The limp in Shadow's left rear leg was more visible now, the old injury announcing itself the way old injuries do when the body is tired and the ground is unforgiving. Ethan slowed his pace without comment. He did not need to explain. Shadow understood. They had been reading each other's rhythms for months now. Two damaged creatures calibrated to the same quiet frequency. By early afternoon of the third day, they had covered roughly 8 miles along the tracks. The landscape had changed. The flat basin had given way to a series of low ridges, and the tracks cut through them in shallow notches that had been blasted out of the rock decades ago. Ethan ran his hand along the cut face of one ridge and felt the drill marks evenly spaced, precise, the work of military engineers who knew how to move earth and stone with economy and purpose. His father's unit, Army Corps of Engineers, the men who built the things that no one was ever supposed to find. He pulled out Daniel's notebook and studied the map again. According to the drawing, the station should be roughly 4 miles ahead, nestled in a natural depression between two ridges, where it would be invisible from any direction until you were almost on top of it. Smart positioning. You could drive a truck within a mile of this place and never know it was there. Ethan closed the notebook and looked at Shadow. The dog was standing still, ears forward, body tense, staring down the tracks. Ethan scanned the terrain ahead. Nothing visible, no movement, no sound except the wind pushing sand across rock in thin, whispering streams. But he trusted the dog's senses over his own. If Shadow said something was out there, something was out there. They moved forward cautiously. The tracks descended into a shallow wash, and for a few hundred yards the rails disappeared entirely beneath a layer of sand deposited by some long-ago flood. Ethan navigated by compass, keeping to the bearing indicated on Daniel's map until the tracks emerged again on the far side, climbing gently toward a low saddle between two ridges. And then the sky changed. It happened fast, the way desert weather always does, without warning and without mercy. The western horizon, which had been clear and pale blue all morning, turned brown, then dark brown, then a churning, advancing wall of dust that rose from the ground to the sky like a curtain being drawn across the face of the earth. Haboob, a dust storm. Ethan had seen them before, but never this close, never when he was this exposed, with no vehicle and no shelter, and nothing between him and the full force of the wind except open desert. He had minutes, maybe less. Shadow come. The dog was already at his side, pressing against his leg, ears flat, body low. Shadow had survived combat, explosions, the chaos of urban warfare. But weather was different. Weather could not be fought. Weather could not be outsmarted. It simply came, and you endured it or you did not. Ethan scanned the terrain with desperate speed. There, to the east, A cluster of rocks at the base of the ridge, not a cave, but a narrow cleft barely wide enough for a man and a dog with an overhang that might deflect the worst of the wind. It would have to do. He ran. Shadow ran beside him, matching his stride despite the limp driven by the same primal understanding that what was coming would not wait. They reached the rocks just as the first gust hit a blast of wind so thick with sand that it turned the air from transparent to opaque in an instant. The sound was enormous, a deep shuddering roar that seemed to come from inside the earth itself, as if the desert had opened its throat and screamed. Ethan wedged himself into the cleft, pulling Shadow in after him, curling his body around the dog and pressing them both against the rock face. He pulled his shirt up over his nose and mouth. He closed his eyes. And then there was nothing to do but wait. The storm lasted 7 hours. 7 hours of wind that tore at their shelter with fingers made of sand and stone. 7 hours of darkness so complete that Ethan could not see his own hand in front of his face. 7 hours of noise so constant and so loud that it erased thought itself, leaving nothing but sensation. The grit in his teeth, the burn in his lungs, the pressure of Shadow's body against his chest, warm and alive and trembling. Somewhere in the 4th hour, Ethan's mind did what it always did when the external world became unbearable. It went inward. It went back. He was in the valley again. Helmand. The sound of the explosion behind them cutting off retreat. Tommy's face in the dust and smoke, impossibly calm, turning toward him with that smile. Good call, big brother. And then the bullet, the spray of red, the way Tommy's body folded in on itself like something vital had been removed from the center and nothing else could hold. But this time in the howling darkness of the desert storm, the memory did not stop there. It continued. It showed him something new, not Tommy falling, but Tommy choosing. The split second before the bullet, when Tommy calculated the angle and made his decision. Not a reaction, a choice. A deliberate act of love disguised as instinct. Tommy chose to save Ethan. That was not Ethan's fault. That was Tommy's gift. The thought arrived quietly, almost lost in the roar of the storm, but it lodged somewhere deep and refused to leave. Ethan pulled Shadow closer. The dog's trembling had slowed, replaced by a deep, steady breathing that matched Ethan's own. 2 heartbeats in the darkness synchronized, holding each other steady through the storm. And in that moment, Ethan understood something he had not understood before. He was not holding Shadow together. Shadow was holding him together. They were holding each other, and that was the only reason either of them was still here. The storm broke some time after midnight. The wind died in stages, retreating like a tide, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt physical, a weight on the ears, a pressure on the skin. Ethan opened his eyes. Stars, thousands of them, more than he had ever seen, scattered across the sky in clusters so dense they looked like spilled milk on black velvet. The air was cool and clean, washed by the storm, carrying the faint mineral scent of freshly turned earth. He crawled out of the cleft and stood up slowly, every muscle in his body aching. Shadow followed, shaking sand from his coat in a vigorous full-body tremor that sent a cloud of dust into the still air. The dog looked up at Ethan, and for the first time in hours his tail moved. Not a full wag, just a small, tired swing from side to side. But it was enough. "Yeah," Ethan said. "We made it." They rested until dawn. Ethan checked their water supply and felt his stomach tighten. Less than 2 days' worth remaining. The storm had pinned them down for 7 hours, during which Shadow had panted heavily from stress, burning through water faster than normal. If the station was not where Daniel's map said it was, they would have to turn back. There would be no second chances. When the sun rose, Ethan noticed something. The storm had reshaped the landscape. Sand that had covered the desert floor for years had been stripped away, exposing rock and hardpan that had not seen daylight in decades. And with it, something else. The tracks. The rails that had been half buried were now fully visible, clean lines of rusted steel running across freshly scoured ground. And ahead, where the tracks curved gently around the base of a ridge, something new had been revealed. Something the sand had been hiding. A structure, low, angular, built from concrete and weathered wood, partially collapsed but still recognizable. A building designed to be functional, not beautiful, with flat walls, narrow windows, and a roof that had caved in on one end but held firm on the other. Military architecture from a different era, built to last but not to be noticed. Station 7. Ethan's chest tightened. He had half expected to find nothing, half hoped for it, maybe because finding nothing would have meant he could go home and tell himself the whole thing was a dead end. An old man's confusion, a ghost chase through empty country. But here it was, real, solid, waiting. Shadow dropped into a working posture, body low, head extended, moving forward with the focused intensity of an animal, doing the job it was born to do. He crossed the distance to the building in a careful, methodical approach, pausing every few yards to test the air. Ethan followed. His training kicked in without conscious thought. He moved the way he had moved through compounds in Afghanistan, clearing angles, checking corners, eyes sweeping every window and doorway for anything that did not belong. The entrance was a doorway without a door. The door itself lay on the ground 10 feet away, torn from its hinges by some past storm and half buried in sand. Ethan stepped through and let his eyes adjust to the dimness inside. Dust, thick, undisturbed, covering everything like gray snow. Broken wooden benches along the walls. A counter of some kind, maybe a dispatch window, with a metal grate that had rusted into lace. Old posters on the walls, faded beyond recognition, their paper curling and brown. A calendar. Ethan stepped closer and brushed the dust from its surface. December 1971. The last month anyone had worked here. But something was wrong. The posters on the walls had not simply faded. They had been torn down, deliberately. Ethan could see the marks where someone had ripped them from the walls, leaving only corners held by pins. The filing cabinet behind the counter were open, empty, with scorch marks on the interior surfaces. Someone had burned the contents, and on the far wall, partially obscured by a collapsed section of roof, there were marks in the concrete that Ethan recognized instantly, because he had seen them 100 times in Afghanistan and Iraq. Bullet holes, not many, maybe a dozen, clustered in two groups chest height, the kind of pattern that comes from controlled fire, not random shooting. Someone had fired a weapon in this room with purpose and precision. Ethan's hand went instinctively to his belt, where a knife rode in a worn leather sheath. His eyes narrowed. This was not a building that had been quietly abandoned. This was a building that had been violently closed, evacuated, sanitized, scrubbed of every identifying detail, and then left to the desert to bury. What had happened here in December 1971? Shadow barked once from the back of the room. The dog was standing near a section of wall that had partially collapsed, pawing at something on the floor. A door, set into the floor at an angle like a cellar entrance, but made of steel instead of wood. Heavy, reinforced, with a locking mechanism that was more sophisticated than anything else in the building. A combination lock built into the handle, military grade, designed to withstand forced entry. Ethan examined the lock closely. It was intact but old. The combination dial stiff with decades of corrosion. He tried the same discharge date that had opened Daniel's ammunition box. The dials resisted grinding against rust. But after working them back and forth for several minutes, the mechanism clicked and the bolt released. The door swung open with a groan of rusted hinges that echoed through the empty station like a voice calling out from underground. Below was darkness, complete and total. The air that rose from the opening was cool and dry, carrying the preserved stillness of a sealed space, a time capsule that had been locked away from the sun and the wind and the turning of the world for 50 years. Shadow went first. Ethan had long since stopped questioning the dog's courage. Shadow descended the steps with his nose leading, his body taut, every sense engaged. Ethan followed the flashlight, sweeping left and right, revealing the contents of the room in pieces, fragments of a picture that assembled itself with each step. Crates, rows of them. Wooden military specifications stenciled with codes and numbers that Ethan recognized from his own years of service. Ammunition, MRES, medical supplies. Communication equipment, water purification tablets. Everything a group of soldiers would need to survive in the field for weeks or months without resupply. A hidden supply depot, built in secret, stocked for a catastrophe that never came. Ethan moved deeper, reading the labels, doing the math in his head. There was enough material here to sustain a platoon for 6 months, maybe longer, and it had never been touched. The crates were sealed, the inventory tags still attached, the packing material still fresh beneath the layers of dust. He thought about the time period, 1969 to 1971, the Cold War at its peak. The Cuban Missile Crisis was only 7 years in the past. The Soviet Union had enough nuclear warheads to destroy every major city in America 3 times over. The United States government had been building secret bunkers and supply caches across the country for years. The Greenbrier bunker in West Virginia, hidden beneath a luxury resort designed to house the entire Congress in the event of nuclear attack. Raven Rock in Pennsylvania, Mount Weather in Virginia, sites that were classified for decades before the public ever learned they existed. Station 7 was the same idea scaled down, pushed out into the emptiness of the Nevada desert where no one would ever think to look. A last resort, a fallback position, a place to survive the end of the world. And his father had helped build it. Ethan stood in the center of the room and let that truth settle over him. Daniel Cole, the quiet man who sold hardware and mowed his lawn on Saturdays and never raised his voice, had once been part of a classified military operation to prepare for nuclear war. He had lived in this desert, walked these tracks, stocked these shelves, and then one day in December 1971, something had happened that caused the whole operation to be shut down, scrubbed, erased, and buried. And Daniel had never said a word. Shadow whined softly from the far wall. The dog was sitting near a corner, his attention fixed on something on the ground. Ethan crossed the room and looked down. A bag, not a military crate. A personal bag canvas, the kind soldiers carried their private belongings in. It was covered in dust, but intact, sitting on the floor, as if someone had set it down carefully and then walked away. Ethan knelt and opened it. Inside, his hands found paper, photographs, letters, a small notebook similar to the one in Daniel's ammunition box, but thicker, more detailed, filled with handwriting that covered every page from margin to margin. He pulled out the first photograph and held it under the flashlight beam. 6 young men standing in front of this very room. The same group he had seen in Daniel's photograph, but a different print, slightly different angle, slightly different moment. The men were laughing. One of them had his arm around Daniel's shoulder. On the back, in handwriting that was not his father's, someone had written the same names: D. Cole, F. Harlan, J. Rivera, B. Mitchell, S. Patterson, K. Greer. Ethan opened the notebook. The first page bore a name written in careful, deliberate letters. Private First Class Frank Harlan. He began to read. The notebook was a diary, Frank Harlan's diary, written in the steady, unadorned prose of a young man who had grown up in the foster care system in Harlan County, Kentucky, enlisted in the Army at 18. Because there were no jobs and no future in the coal country, his family had worked for 3 generations and found himself assigned to a unit that did not officially exist, building a railroad and a supply depot in the middle of the Nevada desert for reasons that were only partially explained to him. Frank wrote about the work, the heat, the isolation, the camaraderie that grows between men who are cut off from the world and dependent on each other for everything. He wrote about Daniel Cole, the unit's commanding officer, a young lieutenant barely older than the men he led, who earned their respect not through rank but through competence and fairness and a quiet, unshakable steadiness that made everyone around him feel that things would be all right. Cole never raises his voice, Frank wrote in one entry. He does not need to. When he talks, you listen because you know he has already thought about it longer and harder than you have. He is the kind of officer you would follow into a burning building because you trust he would not take you there unless it mattered. Ethan's throat tightened. He was reading a dead stranger's description of his own father, and it was more intimate and more revealing than anything Daniel had ever said about himself in 34 years of fatherhood. The diary continued through months of construction routine and the slow grinding monotony of secret work in a forgotten place. And then the entries changed. August 1971. The tone shifted. The handwriting became more hurried, less careful, as if Frank was writing under pressure. Something is wrong. Cole called a meeting tonight. Said higher command detected unauthorized activity in our sector. Someone has been watching us, do not know who. Could be Soviet intelligence, could be domestic. Does not matter. The order came down. Sanitize everything. Destroy all documents. Prepare for immediate evacuation. We have 48 hours. The next entry was shorter, frantic. Evacuation underway. Night movement. No lights. Cole is running the extraction by the book, methodical, precise, but I can see it in his eyes. He's scared, not for himself, for us, for what happens if we do not get out clean. And then the last entry, written in a hand that shook. I went back for the supply manifest in the lower depot. Cole told me to leave it. I went anyway. The door jammed behind me. The combination lock sees some kind of mechanical failure in the gears, radio dead through the concrete. I pounded on the door. I yelled. Nothing. They were gone. All of them. Cole was gone. The entry ended there. No date, no closing. Just the raw, desperate words of a man who had been left behind. Ethan sat on the cold concrete floor, the notebook in his lap, the flashlight casting long shadows across the crates and walls. His hands were steady, but his breathing was not. The weight of what he had just read pressed down on him like the desert heat, invisible but inescapable. His father had left a man behind, not by choice, not with malice, by order, by duty, by the terrible arithmetic of command that says sometimes one man must be sacrificed to protect a mission, to protect a secret, to protect the men who are still moving. The same arithmetic that Ethan had performed in Helmand Province when he gave the order to advance, and Tommy Beckett paid the price, father and son. The same sin, the same scar. He understood now why Daniel never spoke of his service. Not because nothing had happened. Because too much had happened. Because the thing Daniel carried was not a story you tell over dinner or share at a family gathering. It was the kind of truth that sits in the deepest part of a man and never comes to the surface because the man is afraid that if it does, it will destroy everything around it. Shadow moved closer and pressed his head against Ethan's shoulder. The dog's warmth seeped through the fabric of Ethan's shirt, steady and grounding, pulling him back from the edge of a grief that was not entirely his own. And then Shadow's head lifted sharply. His ears locked forward, his nostrils flared wide. His entire body went rigid in a posture Ethan had seen only a handful of times before, the posture Shadow reserved for one specific thing, a human presence. Close, behind the last row of crates. Someone was in the room with them. Ethan was on his feet in an instant, knife in hand, flashlight aimed at the far corner. The beam caught dust motes hanging in the air, swirling in patterns that should not have been there. Patterns disturbed by movement, by breath, by the presence of someone who had been standing in the shadows and watching them. "Come out," Ethan said. His voice was calm, controlled. The voice of a man who had spoken those words before in far more dangerous places. "Come out now." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then slowly a figure emerged from behind the last row of crates. An old man, tall but stoop lean to the point of gauntness, with a white beard that hung to his chest and eyes that burned with a fierce, unbroken intelligence. He wore faded work clothes, patched and repatched, and he leaned on a walking stick made from a twisted branch of desert juniper. His skin was dark from decades of sun-lined and weathered, like the landscape itself. He looked at Ethan. He looked at the photograph in Ethan's hand. And then he spoke in a voice that was rough and dry and cracked from disuse, a voice that sounded like it had not spoken to another human being in a very long time. "You look just like him." Ethan did not lower the knife. "Who are you?" The old man's gaze moved from Ethan to the photograph and back again. A ghost of something crossed his face. Pain, maybe. Or relief. Or both. "My name is Frank Harlan," he said, "and I have been waiting a very long time for someone to walk down those tracks." The name hit Ethan like a round to the chest. Not the impact itself, but the shock wave that follows the part that travels through the body and rearranges everything inside before the mind has time to catch up. Frank Harlan, the man in the diary, the man his father had left behind in this room 50 years ago, standing here, alive, breathing, real. Ethan did not lower the knife. His training would not let him. But his eyes told a different story. This was not a threat. This was a ruin. A man who had been hollowed out by time and solitude until there was barely enough left to hold the bones together. Shadow, however, had already made his judgment. The dog's tension had dissolved the moment Frank stepped fully into the light. Now Shadow stood between the two men. His body relaxed, his tail low, but moving in a slow, uncertain wag. His amber eyes moved from Ethan to Frank and back again, reading something in the space between them that neither man could articulate. Whatever Shadow sensed, it was not danger. It was recognition. The recognition of damage, of loneliness carried too long, of a wound that looked different on the outside but felt the same underneath. "You are Frank Harlan," Ethan said. Not a question, a statement that he was testing against reality, the way you press a bruise to confirm it is really there. "What is left of him?" the old man said. Ethan lowered the knife slowly. He did not sheath it. He held it at his side blade, down a compromise between caution and something else that was rising in him. Something that felt dangerously close to hope. "My father was Daniel Cole." Frank closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were wet. "I know who your father was, son. I knew it the second you came down those stairs. You walk like him. You hold your shoulders the way he did. And you have got his eyes, those gray eyes that looked right through you and made you feel like he already knew what you were going to say before you said it." The silence that followed was the kind that fills a room the way water fills a hole, heavy, complete, pressing against every surface. Two men separated by 50 years and connected by a ghost. The flashlight beam trembled slightly in Ethan's hand, casting shadows that swayed across the crates, like the slow breathing of something ancient and patient. "He did not choose to leave you," Ethan said. The words came out harder than he intended, defensive, as if he was arguing a case he was not sure he believed. Frank leaned on his walking stick and studied Ethan's face with an expression that contained no anger, no accusation. Nothing but the exhausted clarity of a man who has had 5 decades to think about a single moment and has turned it over so many times that all the sharp edges have been worn smooth. "I know that now," Frank said. "I did not always know it. For a long time, a very long time, I hated your father. I hated him the way you can only hate someone you once trusted completely. Because when someone you trust leaves you behind, it does not just break the trust. It breaks the part of you that was capable of trusting in the first place." He paused. Shadow had moved to Frank's side and was sniffing the old man's hand with careful, thorough attention. Frank looked down at the dog and very slowly extended his fingers. Shadow pressed his nose into Frank's palm and held it there. "Good dog," Frank said softly. "You know, do you not? You know what it is like to be the one they leave behind." Ethan sheathed the knife. "Tell me what happened, all of it." Frank nodded slowly. He lowered himself to the ground with the careful, deliberate movements of a man whose body had learned to negotiate with gravity rather than fight it, and sat with his back against a crate. Shadow lay down beside him, resting his head on Frank's thigh, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Ethan sat across from them, the flashlight propped between two crates, casting a circle of pale light in the underground room where his father's secret had waited half a century to be spoken. August 1971. Frank began. His voice had loosened, no longer rough with disuse, but falling into the rhythm of a story that had been rehearsed in silence 10,000 times, waiting for an audience that never came, until now. The order came down fast, no warning. Higher command said our position had been compromised. Someone was watching us. Could have been Soviet agents. Could have been a journalist. Could have been some lost hiker with a pair of binoculars who saw something he should not have. Did not matter. The protocol was clear. Sanitize the site. Destroy all documentation. Evacuate within 48 hours. Leave nothing behind that could prove we were ever here. He shifted his weight, and Shadow adjusted with him maintaining contact. Your father ran the evacuation like he ran everything. Calm, methodical, by the book. He had us moving in teams, burning files, stripping the station of every sign, every label, every scrap of paper with a name or a number on it. He was good at it. Daniel was always good at the hard things. That was what made him a good officer and a terrible liar. You could see the cost on his face even when his voice stayed steady. The evacuation was set for 0300 on the third night. Night movement, no light, straight out to the extraction point 12 miles south, where the trucks were waiting. I was assigned to the final sweep of the lower depot, this room. My job was to collect the supply manifest and the engineering drawings and burn them in the surface building before we moved out. Frank's hand found Shadow's ear and scratched it gently, the way a man touches something alive when he needs to remind himself that he is alive too. I came down here alone, found the manifests, started gathering them, and then the door jammed. The combination lock seized up, some kind of mechanical failure in the gears. I was trapped, underground. No radio signal through the concrete. I pounded on that door until my hands bled. I yelled until my voice gave out. Nobody heard me. Or if they did, they could not come back. The unit moved out on schedule. Your father had 11 men to get to safety across 12 miles of open desert in the dark with a potential hostile presence in the area. 1 man missing versus 11 men exposed. The math is simple. The math is always simple. It is living with the answer that breaks you. Ethan said nothing. He did not need to. He knew that math. He had done that math himself on a mountainside in Helmand province, and the answer had cost Tommy Beckett his life. I got out 3 days later. Frank continued. The lock had a manual release on the inside, a small lever recessed into the frame. Took me 3 days to find it in the dark, feeling every inch of that door, with my fingers bleeding, dehydrated, half out of my mind. When I finally got the door open and crawled up into the sunlight, the station was empty, stripped clean, every vehicle gone, every person gone. Just the desert and the wind and the tracks going nowhere. I walked south. Took me 2 days to reach a road. Hitched a ride to Tonopah. Went to the sheriff's office. Told them who I was. Army, Corps Source of Engineers, Unit 17. They looked at me like I was crazy. Called the Army. The Army said there was no Unit 17. No record of a Frank Harlan in any active or reserve unit. No service number matching mine. No enlistment record. Nothing. As far as the United States military was concerned, I had never existed. His voice did not waver, but something in it deepened, dropping into a register that carried the weight of a man recounting the moment his life was erased. I had no family to call. Grew up in foster care in Harlan County, Kentucky. The county is where I got the name. No parents, no siblings, no one to vouch for me. Enlisted at 18 because it was the army or the coal mines, and I had watched enough men go into those mines and come out as something less than what they were when they went in. The army was supposed to be my way out. Instead, It turned me into a man who did not exist. I tried for 6 months, went to VA offices, filed papers, made phone calls. Every door closed. Every record was blank. They had not just erased the unit, they had erased me. And after 6 months of being told I was nobody, I started to believe it. Frank looked up at Ethan, and in his eyes there was something that Ethan recognized with a shock of familiarity. It was the same look he saw in the mirror every morning. The look of a man who has been so thoroughly disconnected from the world that he has forgotten which side of the glass he is on. So I came back here, Frank said simply, to the only place that could prove I was real, the only place that had evidence I had lived and worked and mattered. I came back to Station 7, and I stayed. 50 years. Ethan's voice was barely above a whisper. 50 years. There is water if you know where to look. An underground spring about 3 miles east in a cave system at the base of the ridge. Deep enough that no satellite or flyover would ever detect a heat signature or a campfire. The depot had enough supplies to last years if you rationed carefully. I built a shelter in the caves. I hunted rabbits. I read the books that were stored in the depot for the soldiers, the ones they packed so men would have something to do while they waited for the end of the world. I must have read those books 100 times each. He paused. A thin smile crossed his face, brief and sad. And I still walk the tracks. Old habit. Every few weeks I walk them end to end and back, the way a man visits a grave. Those are my footprints you found out there. My water bottle too. Careless of me. But after 50 years you stop worrying about being found. You start worrying that no one is looking. So the footprints were Frank's. The water bottle was Frank's. The mystery Ethan had been following since the tracks was not a stranger at all. It was the ghost his father had been searching for across half a century. And I watched your father come back, Frank said. Ethan stopped breathing. The first time was 1985, 14 years after the evacuation. I was sitting on the ridge above the station when I saw a figure walking along the tracks from the south, alone, moving slow. I got my field glasses and watched him. It was Daniel, older, heavier, but I would have known that walk anywhere. He came to the station, went inside, came back out, stood on the tracks and called my name, over and over. Frank. Frank, are you out there? Frank, I am sorry. Frank, please. The old man's voice broke on the last word. He recovered, but it took a moment. And in that moment, the underground room was filled with a silence so thick, it felt like a living thing. I did not go down. I sat on that ridge and watched him call my name for 6 hours. And then he left. He walked back down the tracks and disappeared. Why? Ethan whispered. Why did you not go to him? Frank looked at him with eyes that held no defense, no excuse, nothing but the naked truth of a man confronting his own worst choice. Because I wanted him to feel it. I wanted him to stand there and call out to the darkness and get no answer the way I pounded on that door and got no answer. I wanted him to feel what it was like to be left behind. The words hung in the air like smoke. He came back, Frank continued, every few years, 85, 89, 93, 98, 2002, every time the same thing. He walked the tracks. He came to the station. He called my name, and every time I sat on that ridge and watched and did not answer. And every time he left, I told myself I was right to stay hidden. He deserved it. He left me. He should suffer. But the truth was I was the one suffering. I was the one sitting on a rock in the middle of nowhere, watching the only person in the world who cared, whether I was alive or dead, walk away because I was too proud and too broken to stand up and say, "Here I am." Ethan felt a tightness in his jaw, a burn behind his eyes. He clenched his fists and breathed through it the way he had trained himself to do, holding the emotion at arm's length, not letting it break the surface. Not yet. When did it change? Ethan asked. After 2002, he did not come for a long time. 15 years. I did not know why. Later, I understood. Your mother's health was declining. You were deployed overseas. He had other weights to carry, and he was getting older. The trip was harder every time. Frank reached into the pocket of his worn jacket and pulled out an envelope. It was yellowed and brittle, the corners soft from handling, but it was intact. He held it for a moment, looking at it the way a man looks at something sacred, and then he extended it toward Ethan. Last time he came was 2017. By then I had given up the anger, used it all up. There was nothing left but an old man sitting in a cave wondering what the point of any of it had been. That time Daniel did not call my name. He did not go inside the station. He walked halfway along the tracks, set this envelope on the rail, weighed it down with a stone and walked away, slowly, like it hurt him to move. I could see even from the ridge that he was sick. Something in the way he carried himself. The weight was different, not the weight of guilt anymore. The weight of a body shutting down. I waited until he was gone. Then I went down and picked up the envelope. Inside was this letter. He pressed it into Ethan's hands. Read it. It was not written for me. Ethan opened the envelope with fingers that felt clumsy and thick, as if his hands belonged to someone else. The paper inside was a single sheet covered in Daniel's handwriting. The same careful, deliberate script Ethan had seen in the notebook and on the back of the photograph. But the lines were less steady here. The pressure of the pen uneven, the hand of a man whose body was failing, even as his mind remained clear. Ethan read, "To whoever finds this, if it is Frank, then I owe you more than these words can carry. But these words are all I have left. I followed orders that night. I counted heads and came up one short, and the order was to move, and I moved. There has not been a day since August 14th, 1971, that I have not thought about that decision. I did not abandon you, but I did leave you, and there is a space between those two things where a man can lose his entire life. I have come back to this place 6 times. I have called your name and heard nothing but wind. I do not know if you are alive or dead, but something in me believes you survived, because you were always tougher than the rest of us, and too stubborn to let the desert win. I am sick now. The doctors say months, not years. I will not come back again, but I need you to know this. You were the best friend I ever had, the only man I trusted without reservation. And the weight of what I did to you has been heavier than anything I carried in uniform. If my son finds this letter instead, then he has done what I always believed he would do. He has followed the trail. He is braver than I was. He has his mother's warmth and my stubbornness, and I pray to God he has not inherited my silence. Ethan, if you are reading this, I need you to hear what I could never say to your face. I know you carry something. I could see it in your eyes the day you came home from Afghanistan. I recognized it because I saw the same thing in my own mirror for 50 years. Whatever you did, whatever decision you made that haunts you, you need to know this. Carrying it alone will not make it lighter. It will only make it heavier until it crushes everything good that is still inside you. Do not make my mistake. Do not let silence be your answer. Talk to someone, your sister, a friend, anyone. But do not walk through your life the way I walked through mine, locked inside a room of my own making, pounding on a door that only opens from the inside. Following orders and doing the right thing are not always the same. But staying silent when you should speak is always wrong. I know that now. I wish I had known it sooner. I love you. I should have said that more. I should have said everything more. Your father, Daniel. Ethan read the letter twice, then a third time. Then he folded it carefully along its original creases and held it against his chest with both hands and closed his eyes. The grief came. Not the sharp, jagged grief of sudden loss, but the slow, deep, aching grief of understanding. The grief that comes when you finally see the shape of someone's life from above and realize that the distance between you was never as great as it seemed from the ground. Daniel Cole had spent 50 years carrying the weight of a single decision. He had built a life around it, a family, a home. a quiet existence in a small town. But the weight was always there, pressing down on everything he did, bending him inward, keeping him silent when he should have spoken, keeping him distant when he should have been close. And in the end, the only thing he could do was write a letter to a ghost and a son, and hope that one of them would find it. Shadow moved from Frank's side to Ethan's, crossing the circle of lamplight with quiet purpose. The dog pressed his body against Ethan's and rested his head on Ethan's arm. And the warmth of him, the solid, living, breathing reality of him, was the only thing that kept Ethan anchored to the present. Frank watched them with eyes that were red and wet. He was a good man, your father. I spent decades hating him, and even while I hated him, I knew he was a good man. That is the worst kind of wound, is it not? When the person who hurt you is not a villain, when they are just a man doing the best he can with impossible choices. Ethan opened his eyes. He wrote that you were the best friend he ever had. He was mine, Frank said, even after everything, especially after everything. They sat in silence for a long time after that. The kind of silence that is not empty but full, saturated with things that have finally been said after waiting too long. Words and truths that have been stored underground like the supplies in the crates around them, preserved, and waiting for the moment when someone would finally come to claim them. It was Ethan who spoke first. Come with me. Frank looked up. What? Come with me out of here, back to the world. The old man shook his head slowly. Son, I have been out here 50 years. The world does not have a place for me anymore. I do not have a name. I do not have papers. I do not have anything except this desert and these walls and the memory of who I used to be. That is not true, Ethan said. He reached into his pack and pulled out Daniel's ammunition box. From inside it, he took the photograph, the one showing 6 young men in front of Station 7, and held it out to Frank. This is proof you existed. The notebook is proof. The diary you left down here is proof. My father's letter is proof. You are not a ghost, Frank. You are a man who got lost, and I am not going to walk away and leave you here. Frank stared at him. You do not owe me anything. This is not about debt. My father left you behind because he followed orders. I am not following orders. I am making a choice. And I am choosing not to do what he did. Not because he was wrong. He was not wrong. The math was right. Get 11 men out, lose 1. The math is always right. But the math does not account for what it costs. It does not measure what it takes from you every day for the rest of your life to know that you saved the many by losing the one. Ethan's voice was steady now. Something had settled inside him, not resolution exactly, but the beginning of it, the first solid ground after a long fall. I gave an order in Afghanistan. I told my team to advance on a compound. We walked into an ambush. 3 men died. My best friend died. He died pushing me out of the way. And I have spent 9 years believing that his death was my fault because I made the call. He looked down at Shadow. The dog's eyes were fixed on his face, calm, present. But the truth is more complicated than that. The truth always is. My friend made a choice. He chose to save me, just like my father made a choice. He chose to save 11 men, and those choices were real, and they mattered, and they were made by good men in impossible moments. And blaming myself for Tommy's choice does not honor him. It diminishes him. It turns his sacrifice into my punishment instead of what it actually was. He paused, reached for the compass that hung around his neck. Tommy's compass. He opened it and read the inscription inside the cover. The words he had read 10,000 times, but never truly understood until this moment. True north is not on the map. It is the people you would walk back for. Tommy walked back for me. Ethan said quietly, my father walked back for you 6 times. And you were not ready, and he was not brave enough, and the timing was never right. And 50 years went by. I am not going to let that happen again. Not with you, not with anyone. He stood up, extended his hand. My name is Ethan Cole. I am Daniel Cole's son, and I am walking out of this desert today. You can stay here and spend the rest of your life in a cave, or you can take my hand and come with me and find out whether the world still has a place for Frank Harlan. But I am not leaving you behind. That is not an order. That is a promise." Frank stared at the extended hand. His jaw worked. His eyes glistened. For a moment, he looked exactly like what he was, a 74-year-old man standing at the edge of a decision that terrified him more than 50 years of solitude ever had. Because solitude was familiar, and the unknown was not. Shadow stood up, walked to Frank, and pressed his head against the old man's hand. The dog looked up at him with those amber eyes, patient, certain, unafraid. The same look he had given Ethan in the kennel in Phoenix. The look that said, "I choose you." Frank Harlan took Ethan's hand. They gathered what mattered. Daniel's notebook, Frank's diary, the photographs, the letter. Ethan packed them carefully into his bag, wrapping the fragile paper in a spare shirt to protect it from the desert air. Frank moved through the depot one last time, touching the crates, the walls, the concrete floor, saying goodbye to the only home he had known for half a century. His hand lingered on a shelf near the entrance where a row of books stood, spines cracked and faded from decades of rereading. He pulled one out, a paperback copy of The Old Man and the Sea. He tucked it into his jacket without a word. They climbed the stairs into the station above. Daylight poured through the broken windows, painting rectangles of gold on the dusty floor. The desert outside was still and bright, the air clean from the storm, the sky so blue it hurt to look at. But before they left, Ethan remembered something. He turned back to the depot stairs and descended one last time. In the far corner behind the row of crates that Frank had emerged from there was one crate he had not opened. It was smaller than the others, set apart with a marking on the lid that was different from the military stencils on everything else. A hand-painted symbol, a star inside a circle, and beneath it, written in faded black paint, two words: "For them." Ethan pried the lid open. Inside, folded with military precision, was an American flag. Not a standard issue flag from a supply catalog. This one was different. Someone had sewn patches onto the blue field, small rectangles of fabric, each one bearing a name stitched in white thread. D. Cole, F. Harlan, J. Rivera, B. Mitchell, S. Patterson, K. Greer, and 6 more. 12 names. The entire roster of Unit 17. Beneath the flag was a single sheet of paper. No signature, no date. Just a typed message that read, "This unit will never appear in any official record. These men will never receive public recognition for their service. This flag is the only proof that they existed and that what they did mattered. If you are reading this, then someone remembered. That is enough." Ethan carried the flag up the stairs and then into the sunlight. He unfolded it carefully and held it up so Frank could see the names. The old man's hand went to his mouth. His body trembled. He reached out and touched the patch that bore his name, running his finger over the stitches, the way a blind man reads, learning the shape of something he thought had been taken from him forever. "They knew," Frank whispered. "Someone up the chain knew what they were doing to us, and this was their way of saying we mattered." "It is more than that," Ethan said. "It is a record, and I am taking it home." Ethan folded the flag and placed it on top of the other items in his pack. Then he pulled out his satellite phone, the one he had brought for emergencies, the one he had almost left behind because he had not been sure he wanted anyone to be able to reach him. He dialed Claire's number. She answered on the second ring. "Ethan." Her voice was tight with worry. He had been gone 5 days. He had not called. "I am here," he said. "I am okay. I found what Dad was hiding." "What was it?" He looked at Frank. The old man stood in the doorway of Station 7, leaning on his walking stick, squinting into the sunlight like a man emerging from a long darkness. Shadow stood between them, his tail moving in a slow, steady wag, his amber eyes moving from one man to the other. "I found a man Dad left behind," Ethan said, "and I am bringing him home." There was a pause on the line. Then Claire's voice thick with tears. "I will be waiting, both of you. I will be waiting." They began walking just after noon, three figures moving along the old tracks, heading south, heading toward the fire road where Ethan's truck was parked, heading toward Tonopah and the highway, and the world that had continued turning for 50 years without Frank Harlan in it. Ethan walked on the left. Frank walked on the right, slower, using his stick, but moving with a determination that suggested his body was drawing on reserves it had been saving for exactly this moment. Shadow moved between them back and forth, checking on one and then the other, connecting two men who were still learning how to walk in the same direction. They did not talk much. There would be time for talking later. Time for lawyers and records, and the long, complicated process of resurrecting a man who had been officially erased. Time for Ethan to call Dr. Reeves and tell her that the dog program worked better than either of them had imagined. Time to sit on Claire's porch in Flagstaff and watch the sunset and tell the whole story from beginning to end. But for now, there was just the walking, the rhythm of boots on sand, the steady click of Frank's stick against stone, the soft pad of Shadow's paws, three sets of footprints trailing behind them on the desert floor. Proof that they had been here. Proof that they were real proof that they were moving forward. Ethan reached up and touched the compass around his neck. Tommy's compass. He did not open it. He did not need to read the inscription again. He knew it by heart now, not just the words, but the meaning behind them. The truth that Tommy had understood long before Ethan was ready to hear it. Tommy had walked back for Ethan in a valley in Afghanistan. Daniel had walked back for Frank 6 times across 50 years of desert. And now Ethan was walking forward with both of them, the living and the dead, carrying their stories out of the silence and into the light. The sun moved across the sky. The shadows lengthened. The tracks stretched out behind them, 2 lines of rusted steel disappearing into the distance, leading back to a place that would eventually be found by others investigated. Documented, added to the long and complicated record of things the government built in secret and tried to forget. But that was someone else's story. Ethan's story was simpler. A man walked into the desert carrying a wound he thought would never heal. He found a dog who taught him that trust is not given, but built one silent day at a time. He found a map that led him to his father's secret. He found a stranger who turned out to be the missing piece of a puzzle that had shaped his entire family. And he found a letter that said the only thing that ever needed to be said. Do not carry it alone. The desert stretched out ahead of them, vast and golden in the late afternoon light. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the highway waited. And beyond the highway, the world. Ethan looked at Frank. The old man caught his eye and nodded once. A small gesture, but in it was everything. Gratitude, forgiveness, the tentative, fragile beginning of a trust that had been broken 50 years ago and was just now in the fading light of a Nevada afternoon starting to mend. Ethan looked down at Shadow. The dog looked up at him, tongue-out eyes, bright tail sweeping the sand behind him. No trauma in those eyes, no guilt, no weight. Just the pure, uncomplicated presence of a creature who had decided a long time ago that wherever Ethan went, he would go too, and that was the only decision that mattered. Good dog, Ethan said softly. Shadow's tail wagged harder, and the three of them walked on, following the forgotten rails out of the desert and into whatever came next. Not because they knew what was waiting for them, but because for the first time in a very long time, none of them was walking alone. Sometimes the paths we think are abandoned are the ones that lead us exactly where we need to be. And sometimes the people we think are lost are simply waiting for someone brave enough to follow the tracks and bring them home.